Hi dreamers, today I thought I'd do an off-the-cuff video where we talk about broad-based ETFs. And although you know I'm a dividend investor that focuses on individual stocks, I am a fan of putting ETFs into your portfolio to add diversification. And for some who really don't like to keep up with individual companies or feel that it's too risky, focusing in on a broad-based ETF, or maybe two or three, might be the best of all worlds. So let's take a look at some of the ETF darlings and compare one to the next. So I'm going to use the Seeking Alpha charting tool to build the case for each one, and then check back with Fidelity to look at some of the details. So starting out with an ETF darling, VOO, which is Vanguard's S&P 500 broad index, you can see over the last 10 years a 209% return, which is fantastic. And to that I'm going to add SCHG, which is Schwab's US Large Cap Growth ETF, and update the chart. And you can see I've selected total return, which you can do in the select metrics, hit performance, and select total return. And you can see comparing these two over the last 10 years that SCHG had a 100% more return over VOO. And so before we take a look at the holdings on each of these, let me add three more to the chart. The next one I want to add is QQQ, which is Invesco's product. And here you can see an even bigger return at 399%. Wow, can I find a couple more that are even higher? Let's keep going. Let me go ahead and add VGT to the list, which is the Vanguard Infotech Index Fund, and update the chart. And wow, here you can see a 483% return over the last 10 years. That's almost 300% more than VOO. And lately I've been talking about VGT quite a bit, and many consider it the GOAT of all ETFs. But could I find one more that's even better? Is there any other ones to top this one that's a broad-based ETF in terms of total performance? Let's go one more. For this, I'm going to choose IYW, which is the iShares US Tech ETF. And here you can see the results of IYW just beating VGT. So as you know, one of the things to think about when you're picking any stock or ETF, or really any financial product, just thinking about the relative performance that you expect over the next 10 years. So let's take a look at each of these to figure out why they differ. So starting out with VOO, you can see that this investment is meant to track the performance of the S&P 500, which is a widely recognized benchmark of the US stock market. And so essentially how the entire stock market will do will be reflected in the performance of VOO. And you can see the about 500 holdings here and the relative percentages based on how they are represented in the S&P 500, with the top 10 holdings representing about 31% of VOO. The other nice thing about VOO is that the expenses are very low at 0.03, and it has a yield of 1.46. So now let's go to the one that performed 100% better, SCHG. And here you can see that this one is quite a bit different. It's meant to represent the total return of the Dow Jones US Large Cap Growth Total Stock Market Index. So this one's a little bit more focused on large cap growth stocks. And here you can see they have about 250 holdings, so a little more curated, with the top 10 holdings representing about 54%. And you can see the percentages of Apple and Microsoft at 12%. And that's followed by Amazon and Nvidia at 6 and 5%. And so this one is interesting as you look at the basket of holdings, where you can see that large cap growth focus. So very interesting and pretty broad-based. Now, what is the distribution and expenses for SCHG? Great expense ratio at 0.04, and an okay distribution yield of 0.44. Okay, so now let's take a look at QQQ, which did about 100% better than SCHG. And here you can see that this is a broad ETF that's focused on the NASDAQ 100 index. So this would be the top 100 stocks on the NASDAQ. And so you can see Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Avgo, Meta, Nvidia, etc., etc. And if you click on the holdings, you can see that basket of about 100 stocks and the relative weighting of each of these. And you can also see some non-tech stocks in here, like Pepsi and Starbucks. And in terms of the distribution and expenses, it's got a 0.2% expense ratio and a 0.62% payout ratio. So both relatively low. Now let's go to the one that performed about 100% better than QQQ, and that's VGT. And we just keep ratcheting up the performance here. So VGT is Vanguard's Information Tech Index Fund, and you can see here that the index seeks to track performance of the MSCI US investable market, and that this is made up of stocks of large, mid-sized, and small US companies, but specifically within the infotech sector, as classified under GICS. And so here you can see a very high weighting of Apple at 22% and Microsoft at almost 21%. And so here you can see about 43% of this particular ETF of VGT is simply two stocks, Apple and Microsoft. And the other 60% is divided amongst the next 318 holdings, which is quite a few. And you can see how they stack up here, all within the tech sector, at very small percentages. And in terms of distribution and expenses, we still have a low expense ratio at 0.1 and a pretty low yield at 0.65. And so let's take a look at the final one, which even beats VGT over the last 10 years. And that is IYW at 490%. Can you imagine almost 500% return from an ETF? So let's take a look at this one. So here we're talking about it's seeking to track the investment results of the Russell 1000 tech. But when you look at the top holdings, only about 17% is Apple, and another 17% is Microsoft, so not quite the heavy holdings of VGT. And you can see here there's only about 140 holdings total. And if we take a look at that, you can start to see what they are. Google, Nvidia, Meta, Avgo, AMD, Qualcomm, etc. But all of these are held at a little bit higher percentage. And so what is the distribution and expenses of IYW? You can see a gross expense ratio of 0.4, which is a little bit higher than the others, and a distribution yield of also 0.4. One of the things to consider, which there's been a few more articles on lately, is just why Apple has been a downgraded stock. And two of the reasons are highlighted in this article, which is essentially that there's a challenging economic backdrop in China, because there's been noticeably sluggish demand performance of the iPhone 15 in September. And the other thing noted in this article is that the iPhone business may have reached maturity, which you can kind of see in this graph. The trailing 3-month basis September through November sales, which is the key time for purchasing, have been relatively flat over the last few years. And I only bring that up because that may be a factor as you choose a broad-based ETF. You need to be looking at the top 10 holdings and the specific weights of those top 10 holdings, and really thinking about if you want to bet more on this basket of stocks in this weighting, or this basket of stocks with a little bit of a different weighting. And so it's moments like this where I just remind that past performance does not guarantee future performance. And so all of that begs the question, based on this discussion, where would you put your next dollar if you were a broad-based ETF investor? Would it be the S&P 500, like VOO, large-cap growth stocks like SCHG, the NASDAQ 100, which includes tech and non-tech, or a curated list of only tech stocks with something like VGT or IYW? So I hope that was helpful, and if you have other ideas or favorite ETFs of yours, leave them in the comments. I would love to see them. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this dividend income update, and if you want a richer, real-time experience with me, you can always follow me on Instagram or X. And if you're doing your own research using Seeking Alpha, feel free to find the link below to subscribe if you want, no pressure. As always, I encourage you to do your own research, then implement and learn by putting it into practice. And as a reminder, I'm not a financial advisor, so keep in mind these videos are for entertainment and inspiration only. I'll see you on the flip side.